Hello, and welcome to Union County Reads, a program about writers and writing sponsored by the Union County Entrepreneurs. Writers are, after all, entrepreneurs in that a new book is a new venture, and there are things of a business nature that aspiring writers need to know. But this is going to be even more than that. We're going to have interesting conversation on interesting subjects. Our guest today is very interesting. It is Dr. Robert Billinger, Professor Emeritus of History at Wingate University. Among other things, we'll be talking about his book, Nazi POWs in the Tar Heel State. So welcome to all of you, and welcome to you, Bob.
Thank you very much, Judy.
Well, why don't we begin with the basics, such as, where are you from?
Where are you from? Well, I'm from Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, although if I said that to my kids, my friends growing up, they would say, no, you're not. Because in Eastern Pennsylvania, we say Bethlehem, not like as in Judea, we say Bethlehem. So I grew up and born and raised in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, went to Lehigh University and was introduced to North Carolina other than traveling through it. As a graduate student at University of North Carolina in the late 60s, 1966, until I got a PhD there in 1973.
So how did you wind up in Union County at Wingate University?
Well, I had the good fortune of finding that the dean, where I was working at a little college in West Palm Beach, Florida, where I'd been teaching for 6 years, he had some former friends from Oklahoma Baptist College, maybe it's university by that time, I forget, who were respectively a dean and president up here. And they were looking for somebody in the history department. And he was kind enough to be willing to lose me as he thought valued member of the history department for his little college, and gave me a letter of recommendation. And I was asked to come up here and was very thrilled to be back in the Carolinas.
One thing that I find interesting is for writers or anyone else, how and when does that light come on? How did you know that you wanted to study history and make a career of learning and teaching history?
I think like a lot of people, you're influenced by teachers. And while I really didn't like history that much in high school, because I had a number of what I thought were uninspired people, as a freshman at Lehigh University, I had a fellow by the name of James McVicker Haight, who had was one of those thespians as a teacher, and to make a point, he would, after grading our examinations, and we said too much derogatory about the barbarians taking over the Roman Empire, he would jump on top of the desk and say they were not barbarians, they had cultures of their own. And who would dramatically, when we talked about the Battle of Hastings, show up with a trench coat and then pull it off, revealing that he had this sort of tapestry-looking jacket that was a duplicate of, reproduction of William the Conqueror's wife knitted tapestry portraying the Battle of Hastings. So he was a fascinating guy and appealed both to my my acting interest, because he acted out history, but also his interest in stories and sources and people and thought processes of the past. And so I thought, gee, I'd like to grow up to be like that. And I guess I have.
So I hear there are people that talk very highly of your classes and how very intriguing and interesting they are. I think that theatricality generates interest in people who are listening, more so than just, as you say, you didn't say, but I'll say, a little dull. So you're involved in theater now, and I know you have been for a while. So how do you think that the theater interest and the history interest come together, or do they?
Well, I think they do come together. I think they come together because my interest in history was because I had a very theatrical history professor. I think they come together also because actors who want to get into their roles have to see if they can try to think like and act like and walk like and talk like, not just dress like the people who they're portraying. And so if you're interested in how people think and the world in which they live and the world through their eyes, then you would be interested in how that would be portrayed on the stage. You'd be interested in see how that's revealed in their writings, personal memoirs, letters they wrote at a time, documents produced at a time and place. So I think they go very nicely together.
You are an historian first, an author second. People are always interested, though, in the writing process, and part of this show is to share some things of value involved in writing, the writing process. So how did you decide to write what you've written?
Well, I guess true confessions are that I'm not much of a writer, and it's only due to the extreme patience of my wife and ultimately editors who will help me edit down a German convoluted sentence that often is a paragraph length and might end with a not at the end. When I could get my wife to actually read aloud with a straight face and not get tied up in my language, I knew I was successful. If she said, "I can't imagine what you're trying to say here," I said, "Time for a rewrite." Now, how did I decide to write at all? I decided to write because, of course, if you're going to be a historian and you want to sort of enter the guild, you really need to produce something. And producing something means to get in and roll up your sleeves and do some research, read some documents, look at some artifacts, try to engage with that past period. And I had done that originally in graduate school, and I was particularly interested in German and Austrian history in the early 19th century. And I purposely picked the early 19th century because I wanted to avoid any kind of unnecessary contact with the Nazi era. My people had come to America at the end of the United States from Southern Germany at the end of the 19th century and had missed all that German unification stuff and the First World War and the Nazi era. And I wanted to keep it that way. I really didn't want to run into people who had been Nazis or knew Nazis who were suffered from Nazis. And so I didn't want to talk about Nazis. I don't know where I thought I'd be able to teach where people didn't want to know about Nazis. But in any case, I didn't want to research anything like that. So I picked a nice diplomatic history topic, particularly focusing on the foreign policy of a fellow by the name of Clemens von Metternich, who was the Austrian foreign minister who, for all intents and purposes, sort of ran European affairs, not only for Austria, for much of Europe for about 30 years, from 1815 to 1848. Well, I figured that was a nice, safe topic. All of his heirs and assigns, at least direct ones, were long gone. There'd be nobody to sue me for defamation of character or call me out in a duel or whatever. And I could read other people's mail. I had a Fulbright scholarship to go to Vienna in 1969, 70, and I spent myself off in a little archival building with had 20 little seats where people working on dissertations or books would sit, and we'd be given a box of documents that we would order from their handwritten register, and I could read secret correspondence by Metternich to the emperor or from foreign diplomats to Metternich. And so those were the kind of things now in the process of doing that and living in Austria for a year and then going to South Germany to follow up with South German views on Metternich. When I did that in the late 60s, I kept running into people who were in their 40s or early 50s who would see me as somebody traveling alone, maybe looking forlorn in a restaurant or whatever. And they'd come up to me and they'd address me in German and say, "You're an American, aren't you?" And I said, "Yes." And they'd said, "Oh, I used to work in America. I grew up in America." And I would say, "Really?" I said, "Pardon me, but do you actually speak English?" And they say, "Oh, no." And I would say, you worked in America, you grew up in America, but you don't speak English. And they said, oh, well, I work for Uncle Sam. I said, really, when? And they said, oh, during the war. I said, doing what? And he said, oh, harvesting tobacco, picking oranges in Florida, peanuts in North Carolina, pulpwood harvesting in Louisiana, wherever. And I would go, really? Of course, at that point, I didn't know anything about that there were even German prisoners of war in the United States during World War II. And so this began to kind of come out. And I was fascinated at first, but after a while, it almost became burdensome because I guess I must have had gee, I'm an American, I speak English, talk to me, I'm lonely. I could stand waiting for a train at the station or a railroad trolley car stop, and people would come up to me and want to talk about their good days in America, how they got 3 hots and a cot, and how they ate better than they had in Germany during the war, and how, gosh, they want to go back to America and see the national parks. Or I visited one fella, and all over his living room were these pictures from the national parks because he'd been going back every year. That was one of the fellows actually who had been at Camp Sutton, and who I went to interview, and I found his living room was not cluttered, but you would think he was an American fan of National Geographic magazine or whatever. All the walls were covered with all kinds of national parks. He came back for a number of years. And the reason why I even got a connection with him was that I had read in the Charlotte Observer that this guy from near Cologne, Germany, had been coming back in summers and visiting with a farm family who by the 1960s were getting a bit older, but whose kids and grandkids had visited his family, the German's family in Germany, and he came back to visit them. And I read about that, contacted the local folks, and got his address and contacted him and visited him. And that was back in 1981. And that was one of the first real interviews I did with a German POW. Before that, it was just kind of standing on the street corner or getting my hair cut or sitting in a pub.
Talk a little bit, if you would, about the actual business of getting published.
Yes. Well, I'm still learning about getting published, I guess. Originally, I got published because I had a Doktorvater, and because American degrees in history were patterned after German degrees in history, German terminology, even with non-German historians, kind of carries over. And so people who get history degrees sometimes talk about their doctoral father. And that means their dissertation director. And the dissertation director is a little bit like the godfather. Not only does he have everything from them mow his lawn and look after his kids, while he's helping you with a dissertation, but also thereafter it's expected that he will put you in contact with potential job offers, put you in contact with opportunities for research or presentation or book publishing. So my Doktorvater, who had moved on from UNC to University of Virginia, had contacts with the University of Delaware Press. And so my first book on Metternich's South German policy, how boring for non-historians, was published by University of Delaware Press. In terms of the POWs, I suddenly realized that nobody really in America, certainly non-historians, were not interested in 19th century German history. I did notice, however, that when I told them about meeting German POWs who had been in the United States, their ears perked up. So when I was teaching in Florida for 6 years in the 70s, I began to run into agricultural extension agents who had certified the need for agricultural labor by German POWs and had brought them in from Camp Blanding in northern Florida down out to Clewiston on Lake Okeechobee to do sugarcane cutting. From there, I met somebody who said, oh, you need to talk to this particular judge, Judge Johnston, down in the Palm Beach County Courthouse. He's a district judge. He was an FBI man, and I believe he hunted down an escaped POW who ultimately hung himself. Well, I went to visit that chap, and it was fascinating because he was talking to me about being an FBI agent and called in to investigate an escape and how they had found, he had been with a group that had found this prisoner, former prisoner of war, a young fellow who had committed suicide. And he was trying to refresh his memory, and he stood up at his desk and reached up to a high bookshelf and brought down a diary. He said, I have a wartime diary. Maybe I'll say some more things about it. And as he did that, photograph, a little wallet-sized photograph, had floated to the floor. And he picked it up and he looked at it and he sighed as he handed it to me. And he said, I forgot I even had this. And it was a picture of this poor fellow hanging by the neck. He said, I guess I had to make multiple copies of that and send it to Washington and district headquarters, et cetera. I guess I kept a copy for myself. And those kind of stories that, suddenly made events that had occurred, well, at that time, about 30 years before, seemed very real, very, very, they were very real to the FBI agent who had discovered this young guy's body. And they became very real to me as this leaf from the past came into my life. So, but in terms of writing and finding publishers, academics like to publish with academic presses. It's an ego thing. Academic presses do not provide a big outlet. If you're lucky, they will sell to university libraries, something like 3,000 university libraries in the United States. Not all of them have standing orders from every university press. But, if you can get something published by a university press, you can put that on your resume. Some years ago, a poor chap over at Chapel Hill got a best-selling historical monograph on some civil rights figure that was published by a commercial press, made lots of money. It was not an academic press, and he was not given tenure. Such is the nature of the strange world of scholarship. So the name of the game is to find a university press. So I checked around various university presses, and it seemed to me that if I was writing about Florida, University of Press of Florida seemed like a good place to start. I had written some articles for Florida Historical Quarterly, also published in Gainesville. I knew those people had connections with that press. And so they published my first book on Hitler's soldiers in the Sunshine State. And on the basis of that, when I came up to North Carolina and people began to ask me questions about POWs in North Carolina, I said, well, I don't really know much about POWs in North Carolina. I know something about POWs. They said, well, you really ought to research it. So after I began researching that, I ran it by Florida University Press and said, hey, would you be interested in publishing this, even though it doesn't have anything to do with Florida? And they said, sure, let's take a look at the manuscript. More recently, I had the good fortune to read a terrific manuscript of a novel. I was asked by a writer up in Massachusetts, would I look at this and read it and look for possible errors, historical errors that she might have made writing about POWs. She had read a couple of my books. She got some ideas for sources. They're totally fictitious characters, but in realistic settings with real POW camps in Alabama and North Carolina that I had written about. And so as I was reading this, I was fascinated by it. And I ran off an email to a daughter-in-law of mine who's highly placed in Random House. And I said, gee, I really would like you to look at this manuscript. I haven't been asked by anybody, haven't even mentioned that I have any kind of relationship to anybody in publishing. But she said, well, does this person have an agent? And I said, oh, I'm sorry. No, she doesn't. She told me she doesn't. She said, well, we're normally contacted through agents. And it suddenly, the light bulb went on. Presses think of themselves probably accurately as too busy to cull out the random amateur from a really great novel. And they want some committed agent to read it, to believe in it, to have encouraged corrections early on so that what they're seeing is the pretty professional finished product. And So I guess my advice to novelists is, when you have something that looks pretty good and you've had all your friends and some of your enemies read it, get an agent. And I think sometimes people find it difficult to get an agent because agents, of course, are busy and they're interested in making money. And if they think they will have to flog your manuscript unsuccessfully, they'll be less interested. But to be an entrepreneur, you have to get yourself an agent. You have to play by the rules that are given to us.
Yes, I understand that, going after the agent part. That's not that easy. Now, I know a lot of aspiring writers probably go on Amazon and they find just about anything they want to find and think, well, I'll just whip something out here and I'll get it on Amazon, become a millionaire. How'd you get on Amazon? How hard is that?
I don't know. I haven't really. Oh, how did I get on Amazon? The press sells my books on Amazon as well as to universities and to anybody who writes in. Actually, I have an acquaintance. Perhaps you know the young man who's from Mineral Springs area, one of the Howie boys, who has apparently made a good living by writing science fiction and selling it originally at $1 a piece on Amazon, and ultimately then began to get publishers interested because they realized how many people were buying them at $1 a throw on Amazon. So I am reluctant. This sounds like a double negative, isn't it? I'm reluctant to tell anybody not to try their luck for $1 a piece on Amazon. You may find that you will make money and then publishers will be interested that way. Or you might find you just have made a few dollars. But that will probably make you more money than what I make, because I tell people when they say, where can I buy your book? And I say, well, you can probably buy it from the publisher, or you can buy it on Amazon, or you can buy it used through various sources. But you can also get it from the library, because if you buy it from the publisher, I'll get a total of about 7%, which is about $1. So every time I sell a book, I get $1. So when I go to speak someplace and people say, will you bring books? I'll say, I'm sorry, it's not worth my while to bring 10 books, because I will make a grand total of $10 from carting these around. Just look to your local library.
Exactly. Well, that is where I got my copy of your book, which I said now is a good time. If it's still handy, hold it up so people can see what it looks like.
Oh, will they see it this way?
Yes, they can see it. I can see it. So I assume others can as well.
Great.
Got some POWs in the Tar Heel State.
Yes.
Fascinating book.
This is a picture actually taken at the POW camp at Camp Sutton, and the tall guy in the middle, about 6'4" back in the day, was a fellow I interviewed in Austria back in 2004, a fellow by the name of Eric Moretti. Interesting guy, captured in North Africa, and well, on the way to Camp Sutton and then to Camp Butner.
Well, we're going to get into Camp Sutton a little bit more, but let me first ask you, how did the German POWs, all of them, get to America? How did they wind up here?
Yes, that's a good question. The short answer, I guess, is that because the United States entered the war belatedly from a European perspective. I mean, the war in Europe began in September of 1939. We didn't enter the war until actually December of 1941. So, a good almost 2 years later. By that time, places like France had already been conquered by the Germans, and Britain was really the only ally that had been unconquered. And Britain had more than enough Germans spread out through all of the United Kingdom. And so they were looking for a place to deposit anybody they captured. So when American and British and Free French forces captured the first large numbers of German prisoners of war in the North African campaign in Tunisia in May of 1943, when Rommel's Corps surrendered, the British and the French loaned those prisoners, in quotation marks, loaned them to the Americans to be housed fed, clothed, etc. in America, to be returned, however, to Britain and France at the end of the war. And so they were British and French owned, though they were in America. That came as a big surprise to many of the Germans who, when they were repatriated at the end of the war, were told they were going back to Germany. But in fact, about 2/3 of them wound up spending another year or 2 years in Britain or France, respectively, because the American government had to turn them over for work and rehabilitations of Britain and France and Belgium, as far as that goes. And they wound up spending another year or two overseas. The American government never bothered to tell the Germans they were going to drop them off in those countries. And so lots of Germans who were high on America, loaded up with all kinds of goodies from the PX, silk stockings, cigarettes and stuff, and carried their 40-pound allotted duffel bag full of goodies to bring to the black market or to their families in Germany, and found themselves at Southampton in England, or found themselves at Le Havre in France, and very quickly relieved of their goodies, frequently by German inmates who were already in POW camps in those countries.
I was very intrigued to learn there were a number of prison camps in North Carolina, of course, your book is about. But one in particular, of particular interest, I believe, was the one in Monroe, Camp Sutton. So would you talk about that a bit? I think folks who live in Union County will be particularly interested in that one.
Sure. Camp Sutton was a large engineering facility. A temporary facility was created at the beginning of the war to train people in the engineering corps, that is to say, truck drivers, bulldozer folks, people who constructed and deconstructed equipment, build bridges, etc. It was a segregated camp, as all military facilities were, like the United States Army was at that time. One side of Richardson Creek had black troops. Another side of Richardson Creek had white troops. Never the twain shall meet, except, of course, black troops had white officers. Some of those black troops with white officers, I found out later, not only from written sources, but running into former white officers who were with them, wound up building the Alcan Highway in Alaska, and later on found themselves building the Burma Road in the Asian Pacific War. But in that large military facility on the outskirts of Monroe, the first large number of German prisoners of war in North Carolina came. Originally, German prisoners of war had been brought to the United States in the summer of 1943, directly from North Africa. They had landed in places like Norfolk or in New York City, but had been put on trains and sent to camps in Texas, very large, 3,000 to 5,000 POWs in Texas, numerous camps in Texas, in Oklahoma, in Arkansas, and Alabama. After about a year or so, when the American government realized that the number of escapes, or attempted escapes actually, was actually slightly fewer than attempted escapes from federal maximum security penitentiaries, the Germans had really no place to go if they escaped. It was usually more on a lark, or to get away from POWs in the camp that they were at that they couldn't get along with. We can talk about that later if you like. There were conflicts between folks of Nazis, anti-Nazis, people of different nationalities in German uniforms, people of different branches of the German service. They would often try to escape. They would be then put on bread and water and solitary confinement for 2 weeks, but then often transferred to another camp. Their goal was sometimes just to see if they could escape briefly, sometimes to see if there were any girls locally, sometimes just because they got stir crazy, or sometimes just because they wanted to be transferred to another camp. But at any rate, when the American government realized that they could actually be useful on work projects for the American Army, they began to disperse them to various military establishments in what ultimately were 45 of the 48 United States. Actually, some were sent to Alaska. Alaska at that time was not part of the United States. It was a territory. But 45 of the states, including North Carolina. The first large group of POWs in North Carolina actually came from a camp in Alabama, Aliceville, Alabama, northwestern Alabama, and there were 750 of them. They came in March of 1944, fairly late in the war. All of those people had been in the United States or most of them, since the summer of 1943. They were all Afrika Korps people, or people who were captured along with the Afrika Korps Rommel's people in 1944. Later on, the camp at Camp Sutton became merely a branch camp of much larger facilities, one that was created with about 3,000 POWs at Fort Bragg, and another one at Camp Butner north of Durham that had about 3,000 people. And those major camps then administered smaller camps like Camp Sutton.
Bob, I think it would be interesting. I imagine the people in this general area who are listening would be very interested to know more specifically where Camp Sutton and the facilities for the prisoners were located in Monroe.
Yes, the prisoner of war camp location was in front of the water tower if you're heading east on Highway 74, and you go down the hill across Richardson Creek and then come up the other side. As you about breast the top of the hill, if you look to the left, there's a large water tower back there, area that's been industrialized. There used to be a textile plant back there. I'm not sure. I haven't been back in recent years. Turkey processing, various things. The water tower is a new tower, but there was a water tower there during Camp Sutton days, and the POW camp was an enclosure that was right in front of that water tower. So it was at the corner of one of the streets is Stitt Street. I forget the other name of the street there, but that was where the enclosure was. The eastern gate of Camp Sutton, that is to say, the large military establishment, was off of Old Monroe Road. Of course, the 74 now sort of runs parallel to the Old Monroe Road and is somewhat north of it. And so the main gate from the east side of Camp Sutton was off the Old Monroe Road, about at that intersection as you come up the hill and you turn left to go to the industrial area. So that was all Camp Sutton. All that area to 74 was Camp Sutton, and it stretched down as far as Quincy's, if you're familiar with that. So that would be Highway 200, I guess. I think that's 200. So when I talked to former mailmen who were little boys who used to talk to POWs and give them American cigarettes at the wire when they were working on the American base, they would often talk to the POWs there about where Quincy's is. But that was away from the POW camp, but on the larger Camp Sutton. It was a rather large facility and trained. Gosh, there's a North Carolina highway sign out. I forget, several 100,000 GIs. Taught them engineering, which basically means driving dump trucks and running bulldozers and that kinds of things. It was a segregated facility, as all American military installations were at that time. And one side of Richardson Creek were black soldiers and the other side were white units. Black units, of course, had white officers. And one of the sort of sad stories about Camp Sutton, but the nature of American history, was that the facility, the American military facility at Camp Sutton, closed down rather prematurely in October of 1944 for several reasons. But one of the reasons was that white citizens of Monroe and black military who were visiting in Monroe and would go downtown to enjoy themselves on weekends and time off, got into some trouble together. A busload of black soldiers was stoned. Shortly after that, military authorities on the base realized that somebody had gotten into a lockup in an arsenal and stolen about a couple of dozen pistols. They shut the camp down. They made whites and blacks take a big hike 20 some miles down to Pageland. And while they did that, they had fellows from off base, military personnel they brought in from Norfolk and other places to basically search for the weapons on the grounds. And because of the possibility of racial tensions, and because basically most of the training had been done and they were hoping the war would be over shortly, they closed the base. Interestingly, the POW camp lasted for another about 8 months. And one of the chief duties of the German POWs was to help dismantle the American military base. So interestingly, I got that story from several locations. One of the places I got it was from another former GI who had actually been suffered frostbite in Italy, had been in a hospital in Norfolk recuperating, had been given the chance to, or ordered to come to Monroe to help as an outsider try to find those guns in the base. He fell in love with a Monroe girl, and in 1980, I happened to interview him, and he told me about this. Shortly thereafter, I saw in official and military records of the war a similar story, which corroborated. Of course, it's always nice. Historians like some corroboration. When people's memories sometimes are faulty, and they may elaborate a little bit because it's a better story. But unfortunately, his story was true about the camp closing rather prematurely and because of, well, racial difficulties.
That is sad, but not very surprising, I'm afraid.
No, not at all.
What about the individual? It was a prisoner, right, who escaped from Camp Sutton?
Who was killed while attempting to escape? Yes.
Yes. How did he go about that?
Well, he was on a wood cutting detail down around South Carolina, right over the border near Van Wyck. And according to what the guards told, and therefore what got relayed to the International Red Cross and back to the German, War Office, etc., was that supposedly he had escaped. They went looking for him. When they told him to halt, when they saw him, he didn't halt. They shot him, and he died. Now, interestingly, when I first heard about this, I was in the National Archives and was looking at an International Red Cross report. And a Swiss visitor on behalf of the International Red Cross had been visiting at Camp Butner and had attended a funeral for a fellow who had escaped on July, I forget the date anymore, 1944, was the fellow who was shot at Van Wyck. And he was buried at Camp Butner. And the International Red Cross visitor from Switzerland attended this ceremony and, of course, documented that in his International Red Cross report and told about how at the ceremony there had been the swastika over the German flag over the coffin, and an American military policeman fired a 3-gun salute, and one representative, I think, from Camp Sutton was there, but mostly attendees were from Camp Butner, POWs there. And interestingly, one of the first German POWs who I, with intentionality, interviewed was a fellow by the name of Buschheuer, who lived south of Cologne. And I visited him in 1981. And when I went to visit him, he had been a cook at Camp Sutton during the war. I interviewed him and I said, by the way, did you ever run into a guy at Camp Sutton by the name of Werner Friedrich Meyer? And he said, where do you know that name from? And I said, oh, never mind. Why don't you tell me where you know that name from? And he said, Werner came to me and he said, you know, you tried to escape in Africa sometimes. I'm planning to escape. Do you want to escape with me? I'm going to escape in the next few days. And he said, I just told the Werner, I said, when I tried to escape in Africa, I was captured. We're further from any kind of German units here. I'm not going. That's crazy. And he said, that was the last time I talked to him. That's the last time I ever really heard anything about him until you mentioned his name now. And then I told him how I'd read International Red Cross report of his burial at Camp Butner. And he sighed and said, oh, I always wondered what happened to him. So it was a kind of an interesting situation where I knew more than someone who was there because I knew the rest of the story.
I found it extremely interesting to hear about some of the individual prisoners that you wrote about. One in particular was a man named Fritz Teichmann. Tell us just a little bit about him.
Fritz Teichmann was a very interesting guy, both in his youth and also when I first came to meet him personally, and when he was in his 80s. Fritz Teichmann was a musician, a vocalist, as well as a piano and organ player. He was captured in Sicily in 1943, was brought to the United States, originally to Fort Gordon in Georgia, and then transferred up to Camp Butner in North Carolina. Because of his musical skills, and because of his piano playing, field organ playing skills, he was a chaplain's assistant, both for the German chaplains, but also was popular enough that he was actually invited on numerous occasions to play at the post chapel for the commandant at Camp Butner. And that lasted for a while until, unfortunately, Fritz ran afoul of an intelligence officer who suspected him of being a Nazi. From what I learned of Fritz Teichmann, just interviewing him and spending a night with him in Germany back in the beginning of the 21st century, he had plenty of reasons to suspect Teichmann not of being a Nazi particularly, but being of a bit of a troublemaker. Teichmann always claimed that he wasn't a Nazi, and I think he probably wasn't, but I think he enjoyed working the system whenever he could. He was the kind of guy who realized, for example, when they were working in a tobacco warehouse outside of Durham, he realized that you could be paid by what he called the Tobacco Mafia. There was apparently a system by which any tobacco leaves that would fall on the floor, either in the loading of the already purchased tobacco or in the conveying of the tobacco onto the shelves where it was then sold to buyers, that would be the property of the people who owned the warehouse. The so-called Tobacco Mafia paid German prisoners of war to unintentionally, accidentally, on purpose, drop extra tobacco so that the warehouse owners would have extra tobacco that they could sell separately. Now, with that kind of money, which Germans were not supposed to have, American money, because the American government was fearful that Germans might try to escape, and for that they would need American money. They were always paid for their labors in camp script, little coupons that came in 5-cent, 10-cent penny amounts, up to 80 cents a day for every day that they worked. Of course, those were not redeemable any place except in the POW PX, where they could buy beer in the good days, soda, handkerchiefs, extra writing, pencils, pens, papers to write home to mama, etc. Well, so Fritz not only was an entrepreneurial enough to know when to drop tobacco and get American coins, he also had relationships with some of the guards and had the guards hold the money so that when they were frisked going into the gates of the camp, they would not have American money. And the guards would hold the money for a percentage of that money. He also realized that the blacks who worked in the warehouses, also as civilians, did not have access to washing powder to wash their clothes, or at least they didn't because it was rationed. The POWs did have access to that to wash their clothes. So he would sell washing powder to American blacks with whom he was working, and he would make money doing that too. Ultimately, he never got a chance to use any of the American money because he never had a chance to escape. But along the way, the intelligence officer at Camp Buckner decided that Teichmann might be communicating with people and furthering Nazi ideology by playing certain German music. I'm sorry, my music, I'm not enough of a musician to remember exactly which were the pieces that the intelligence officer picked out. Teichmann claimed they had nothing to do with Nazi ideology whatsoever. But in any case, the intelligence officer pegged Teichmann as a troublemaker and a Nazi and had him assigned to a stockade 11, where people who were considered to be either pro-Nazi or at least incorrigible types were kept. Teichmann was assigned to stockade 11 at Buckner. And he always kidded that it was a privilege to be in that stockade because originally people in that stockade, because they were considered escape risks, were not allowed to work outside, which meant basically they were not allowed to work. Later on, the American government decided they were not risks and they were let to work in any case. Teichmann also claimed that there were really not many, if any, Nazis in 11, but they were mostly German soldiers who upheld their duty. And of course, that's the kind of, as somebody who lived through the Vietnam War and realized how Americans felt about people who, fled to Canada or whatever, and certainly somebody who knew people who could not believe in the Vietnam War, but yet were trained to and loved their buddies enough to even give their lives for them. I understand something about a military cohesion, that you would not betray a fellow German. You would be loyal even if you didn't particularly care for the government, even if you were not a member of that political party, et cetera. So I was willing to give Teichmann a pass on most of those things in my judgments. But so a very interesting character, very forthcoming, had pictures of himself directing choirs, was a fellow up into his 80s, at least. I lost track of him over the years, but up into his 80s would not only go to Wagnerian concerts at Bayreuth or Bayreuth with former POW buddies of his, including a former camp doctor at Buckner, a Viennese by the name of Dr. Gasser. They would go to Bayreuth over the years and go to Wagnerian operas together in post-war Germany. So he was an interesting guy, and he would do that. He annually also was a great guy for hiking in the Alps. He did that, and he would send me pictures from his hikes in his short shorts. I would call them Lederhosen Hiking. And so he was a charming and interesting guy. He married an English lady, and because I arrived at their house late in the evening, they invited me to stay for dinner and then overnight. But as the evening wore on, and as I was beginning to be more of an interrogator than his wife felt comfortable with, she decided to leave and was very upset because she thought I was accusing her husband of being a Nazi, where I had just said, some people in that, that particular stockade were sent there because the American government considered them Nazis. She took that as an insult to her husband. So I saw very little of her the rest of the evening because she didn't feel good about that. But an interesting character, and a musician who claimed that when he was captured, he had by the American troops, he was privileged to have never have shot a weapon in anger during World War II. He was a radio man and was with a unit that was supposed to be listening to American troop movements, and they got on the wrong road and suddenly saw a bunch of American tanks coming in their direction. They recognized the American tanks before the Americans recognized them, but their Jeep, their lieutenant said, "Hey, we're going to surrender before these guys start shooting us up, because as soon as they discover who we are, we're goners." So they left the Jeeps, raised their hands, and surprised the Americans by surrendering to them.
This is an ignorant question, but I shall ask it anyway, because I'm sure others may not know. Is there a difference between a Nazi soldier and a German soldier?
Yeah. During the war, the American press used the word Nazi soldier almost exclusively for anybody in a German uniform. The blanket and coverage term is men in German uniform, because in terms of as prisoners, the Americans segregated prisoners based on the units, the uniform of the unit they were captured in. So members of the Wehrmacht, that's the German armed forces, that meant the Army and Air Force, were considered Germans, period. Now, if you were, before Germany annexed Austria, you were in a German uniform, you were a German. If you were forced to volunteer to be in the German army when they captured Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, you were a German as far as the Americans were concerned. Didn't matter if you spoke German, didn't matter if you had volunteered to join the German army, had been conscripted in the German army, drafted in the German army, you were German. The American press called all Germans Nazis. So what the American military began to realize is that not all Germans were Nazis, not all men in German uniforms were German. And Camp Butner ultimately had what was known as a United Nations stockade. Those were people who had declared that they had been drafted in the German army or inducted in the German army against their will. And they were people from places like France or the Netherlands, or Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Norway, Denmark, etc., and actually volunteered to serve with their national forces against the Nazis. And a number of those people actually who were French were able to rejoin the French army and the Foreign Legion and actually helped to liberate France at the end of the war, having been captured originally in German uniform, later put in French uniforms, again, as Frenchmen fighting the Germans.
All right. We are coming close to the end of the time that we have, so I just want to ask you a couple of things. And one is, before you began writing, or let's say before you went to visit people that you had written about, did you have preconceived notions that proved wrong or right?
I'd like to be able to say I had preconceived notions about people. One of the problems is when I was growing up, like the German POWs, I spent the summer in Austria. The summer I turned 21 and was treated very nicely by Austrians. Most everybody who was male, who were at that time in their 40s, late 30s or early 40s, had served in the German Wehrmacht. And so I guess initially, the first former members of the German Wehrmacht I met were the fathers of the kids I ran around with that summer and went hiking with, went on tours of Austria with. One of the interesting guys in the neighborhood actually, who was the father of one of the girls that we were hanging around with, took me along with their family up to Melk to see an outdoor musical performance. And the father, I suppose, decided that true confessions were best early on. So we were driving. As we were driving, he said, "Now, Bob, you may hear things from my neighbors that rumors that I was a Nazi. And I'm sorry to admit that I was." And they began to make all kinds of excuses. How, as a young businessman, you had to do that to get ahead. So I wasn't surprised that people were members of the Nazi Party. I would not have been surprised if there had been more people who had been Nazis. I wouldn't be surprised if some of the young, well, one of the fellows I interviewed, a very sympathetic guy, who had been drafted as a 17-year-old into the Waffen-SS, the armed forces of the Nazi Party, and who was wounded, woke up in a British hospital, celebrated his 18th birthday at Camp Butner. Later on was liberated earlier than his other German colleagues because Austria, divided by the Allies, was declared to have been a victim of Nazi aggression. And therefore, if you lived in a postal code, you came from a place that now became an independent Republic of Austria, you were sent back. And so by the fall of 1946, when many of his colleagues were spending another year POW camps in France or in Britain, he was back in school at a university becoming a teacher. He became later on a principal. And he said, "I'm embarrassed to say, as a 21-year-old, I still had not matured enough so that when I was at the university and the older professor said something about the Nazi era, how the time of mistakes, he said, I hooted him down from the back of the room." He said, "I'm embarrassed that I said that, but as a 21-year-old, I had not gotten over the idea that we had fought and served for the fatherland as we understood it." And he said that as a 17-year-old, as a member of a Waffen-SS unit, Waffen-SS, the armed forces of the Nazi Party per se, a separate army. Now, originally, those were the people who were the concentration camp guards. Later in the war, rather than having volunteers, they just drafted young kids. I mean, this guy, as a 17-year-old, had been told out of high school that he would be drafted. He thought maybe he could become a pilot. He signed up for the Air Force. He got greetings from the Fuhrer. You remember the Waffen-SS. He went back to the conscription office and said, "There's got to be a mistake. I volunteered for the Air Force." They said, "Yes, but the Fuhrer needs you in the Waffen-SS." He said he was in the Waffen-SS by mistake. He didn't say that it was the worst thing that ever happened in his life. But he also said that as a 17-year-old in France before D-Day, as a Waffen-SS unit, they took actions against people who the Nazis declared as bandits and terrorists. That's a euphemism for people who were members of the Maquis, who slit Germans' throats, who burned up military supplies. As a 17-year-old, he had burned down villages and gunned down inhabitants of villages. He didn't ever say that exactly. He said, "We were forced to take action against brigands," and he looked at me inside and said, "I'm afraid you probably know what that means." So I was able to intuit that, yes, he was involved in what Custer had been involved in with the American Indians.
Well, Bob, I don't really want to quit interviewing you because this is fascinating. I hope that everyone who's listening has been as interested in the conversation as I have, and will tune in to future Union County Entrepreneur, Union County Reads episodes. Everyone has to live up to Bob being so interesting now. So thank you all so much. Bob, thank you so very much. And perhaps we'll talk again whenever you get your next book ready.
Super. Keep reading, folks. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Bob.
Bye-bye.